Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of seminar. Today's first lecture is teaching Korean American immigration history and post-LA uprising and political awakening by Miss Carol Park. Miss Park is the author of a memoir of Patriot Korean Americans, Racism and Riots, and co-author of Korean Americans, A Concise History. He is also a filmmaker and researcher. The LAist recently featured her story and research. Please welcome Miss Park.
Thank you so much, President Kim, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this very early morning. My apologies if I sound a little congested. I am just getting over the flu, so bear with me if I cough a little bit. But again, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to dive right in since we don't have as much time. So we'll go ahead and start like this. And I want to invite you all to also ask questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. Maybe a little bit toward the end, I'll leave some room for that as well. But for now, I'm going to dive right into it. So what I'm going to be talking about today is teaching Korean American immigration history and post-LA uprising and the political awakening of the Korean American community. And I want to make a very big distinction here. When we're talking about Korean Americans, we're talking about the community, the diasporic community that lives in the United States here. We're not talking about Koreans in Korea. And I want to make that very distinctive. The identities are vastly different. For example, myself, being a Korean American woman, I would be looked at differently if I went to South Korea today. They would know that I am definitely not born and raised in South Korea. They would know that I was born here. And so that identity is extremely distinctive. And it's something that we have to note when we teach Korean American immigration history, because the Korean Americans that came here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were also distinctive. They were fighting for homeland politics or for homeland independence, but they also developed their own distinctive identity. So I want us to keep that in mind as we dive into teaching Korean American immigration history first. So just to give us an idea and a background of where Korean Americans belong in the Asian American population, the most recent...
Could you do full screen of your slides? We see like the sidebars.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me go ahead and do that.
I think that way we can also see the text bigger.
Does that help?
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay.
Thank you.
There we go. Okay. So Korean Americans in the Asian American population, according to the most recent census data of 2020, so these are updated figures from what I presented last year, we are part of the 24 million Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islanders population in the United States. Of those 24 million, here you can see the largest categories as broken down by the Pew Research Center. There are 6 origin groups that make up 85% of all Asian Americans. That's quite a bit, is it not? And those 6 origin groups include Korean Americans. Here we are at 9%. Chinese, of course, making up the largest. The most fascinating data that came out, however, is this: that Asian Indian alone population became the largest group of Asians in the US in 2020. It's one of the first times we've seen this. It used to always be Chinese Americans, but the Asian Indian alone population increased 54.7% to about 4.4 million and surpassed the Chinese, except Taiwanese, alone group, who came in second at 4.1 million. But if you take alone or in any combination, Chinese are still the #1 Asian populous group in the United States at 5.2 million, according to the Census 2020 data. Now, why am I giving you all of this? Well, it's because I want to give you some context on where Korean Americans are in the Asian American population. Korean alone population rose 6% to 1.5 million in 2020. The Korean population alone, or in any combination population, grew 16.6% from 2010 to 2020 to reach 1.9 million, or 1,989,519. This is quite a significant increase if you think about where we came from. In 2020, again, we see that number is large. In 2015, it was 1.8 million. In 2010, it was 1.7 million. In 2000, it was 1.2 million. I've got some other numbers here. In 1990, that figure was 798,849. And in 1980, that was 354,953. So thinking about that for 1 minute, when we're teaching Korean immigration history, we're realizing just how much this population has truly increased since 1980, post-1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which allowed for immigration from Asia to increase as well as other countries. So this is phenomenal. Why would we then say, okay, well, sure, Korean Americans are increasing in population. This is nice, whatever. It's like every other minority group in the US. Well, we have to teach Korean immigration history because about 1/4 of Asian Americans say they're well informed about Asian history in the United States. 50% say they are somewhat informed. Only 5% say they are extremely informed. Only 19% say they are very informed. The rest of us are, we kind of get it. We kind of understand what our history is. Maybe not. And this is problematic because, to quote Dr. Edward T. Chang, whom you will see next, if you don't know your history, you're on shaky ground. If you don't know your history, you won't know why and how your community is where it is at today. So, Korean Americans are not informed about US Asian history. 25% of the Korean American population are not informed about US Asian history. 24% of Korean Americans say they are informed about US Asian history. The rest fall somewhere in between. Clearly, there is a need to teach Korean American history as part of the larger scope of Asian American history. And now even more so than ever. Why? Because of the popularity of Korean dramas, of Korean food, of K-pop, right? Of the Hallyu wave, of the influx, right? Of Korean culture from the homeland. All these things make it very important for us to understand that when teaching Korean history, we have to teach about Korean immigration history. Here are some statistics as well. These are the top 10 US metropolitan areas by Korean population in 2019. Los Angeles remains the heart of Korean America at 326,000. Of course, these numbers are slightly higher now than they were in 2019, but these are just your general numbers. New York at 220,000, Washington, Seattle, Chicago, San Francisco, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Dallas, and surprisingly, San Jose, California, right up there in the north of California. So these are the top 10 metropolitan areas. This means if you look at this top 10 areas, that we're spreading out. We're no longer just on the East and West coasts. We're going to places like Atlanta, Georgia, right? We're in Philadelphia, we're in Dallas, we're moving around. If you look at the migration patterns of Koreans in the United States, we're beginning to go to places like Indiana, right? Places you wouldn't think we would go, but we are. And so again, teaching Korean American immigration history is important because this movement then tells us that, look, where Koreans go, there may not be understanding. There may not be an awareness of the histories, why and how Koreans first started coming to the United States. So an extremely important thing to think about and or consider. Excuse me. So now you're probably thinking, okay, that's great. Let's teach Korean American immigration history. What are some resources? And I've compiled a list here for you. Koreans in America by Bong Choi. It's a very good book that gives you a basic understanding of how Koreans began to come here. Official Korean immigration to the United States would begin on January 13th, 1903. And this is an important date because it's when the first 102 Koreans would disembark off a ship in Oahu, Hawaii, and come to the US as basically plantation workers. From there, they would go to the US mainland. Now, does that mean there were no Koreans here prior to that? Of course not. There were Koreans here, but they were very small in population. And in fact, they weren't even really counted by the US government. It wasn't until 1903 in January that the US government officially recorded these 102 Koreans as the first Korean immigration wave. And Bong Choi talks about that as well. Of course, the book that President Kim mentioned, Korean Americans, A Concise History, which I happen to have here. It's a cheap resource, about $10 as well. It goes back, it's donated, all that good stuff for more books for kids. That one tells a concise history of Korean Americans as well, beginning with the official migration. It tells stories of Dosan Ahn Chang-ho. Of course, the first Koreatown, USA, Pachappa Camp, which is a book you should also probably pick up by Dr. Edward T. Chang. And then The Korean Frontiers in America, Immigration to Hawaii by Wayne Patterson. That one is also just a wonderful resource as well. Pachappa Camp, the first Koreatown, Korean American Pioneer Aviators, The Willows Airmen by Dr. Edward T. Chang and Mr. Dosan Han. That book is amazing because if you're teaching Korean immigration history and Korean American immigration and history, you'll be surprised to know that the South Korean Air Force traces its origins back to the United States up in Willows, California, Northern California, over there near San Jose. And that's because in 1920, Korean Americans opened their own aviation school, the Willows Korean Aviation School and Corps, where they trained South Korea's first aviators or combat pilots, their first two aviation officers. They graduated from this school and went on to be appointed by the Korean Shanghai Provisional Government as the first aviation officers. So it's a very fascinating book, teaches wonderful immigration history as well as Korean American history and its ties to the Korean independence movement, which was a big part of the Korean American population's efforts during the early 1900s. Then there's also The Koreans in Hawaii, a pictorial history from 1903 to 2003 by Roberta Chang with Wayne Patterson. That's a great book because it gives you visuals that you can use to show to your classrooms, especially if you're teaching K through 12. It's wonderful because it gives you that pictorial image versus just looking through texts, right? And giving exams. So it's a great resource there. I'm going to pause here for a second and see if anyone has any questions. No? Okay, we'll continue. So I have a second list of resources here for you. There we go. To Save the Children of Korea, The Cold War Origins of International Adoption by Arissa Oh. This is a great book that talks about post-Korean War, and how that affected the influx of Korean orphans into the United States. Korean orphans is something that we don't truly talk about when we talk about Korean American history and Korean immigration. A lot of children were brought to the United States either as documented, but mostly as undocumented children who were adopted, and they were brought through organizations, including Holt International, who would basically say, please adopt these war orphans and save them. And so they would bring them. And many of these Korean children would come to the United States not knowing their own Korean culture or their histories because they were babies. And they would grow up in these adoptive families only speaking English, not understanding that they were war orphans. And so it's an important thing to realize that there's a large community of those children who are my age and older now beginning to realize, oh my gosh, I'm undocumented, or oh my gosh, I don't know certain things about my history. And they want to learn Korean culture. They want to learn where they come from. And that's why, again, it's so important to teach Korean American immigration and history properly. Someone's asking, is there a reason why a majority of Koreans have migrated to California compared to other states within the US? Yes, that's a great question, Amber. So Korean Americans, when they were in Hawaii, they would come to the US mainland and they would come through California. So they started to settle here first, and they began to settle in places like Riverside, California, which Dr. Chang has recently discovered is the first Koreatown in the United States. And they would settle along in places like Willows, San Jose, Dinuba, and Los Angeles, of course. And that's why they started coming, because they first started coming from Hawaii and then would go through Angel Island later in 1910 when it would open, of course, and go through San Francisco, travel down. Then they would also make their way across, right, to the east and go to New York. They would also come through there as well, but mostly through Hawaii and through San Francisco. Hopefully that answers your question. Any other questions before I continue? And I take a drink of water. No other questions? Okay. So the next resource I want to offer to you is Koreatown, Los Angeles, Immigration, Race, and the American Dream by Shelley Sang-hee Lee. It's a pretty great book about Koreatown, LA, and it kind of gives us a little bit of a fast forward into more modern times. And a very recent book that came out that kind of transitions us into the LA civil unrest is Rising from the Ashes by Paula Yu. It just came out last month, I believe. I see Micho says, many Korean-born adult adoptees want to learn about KA history, but not enough universities and organizations teach it. I 100% agree, Dr. Cho. We definitely need more Korean culture classes, Korean history classes, Korean American studies classes, and so forth. I know that at UC Riverside, it is offered. Dr. Chang teaches that class, and when I'm not being a graduate student, I also teach that class. And I might be teaching that class next year at Cal State Long Beach. So it's starting to gain some traction, which is wonderful news, right, for Korean educators, right? Okay, so Rising from the Ashes is this next book that I want to talk to you about. This book, again, just came out in May, and it's wonderful because author Paula Yu, who is herself Korean American, really does her due diligence and does an excellent job in researching the Korean American perspective of the LA civil unrest. It's absolutely wonderful. She talks about Eddie Lee's family and Eddie Lee's family's experience as Korean immigrants. She talks about Soon Ja-doo's family and her experience and why and how that tragedy happened with Latasha Harlins and the shooting and murder of that young 15-year-old girl by Soon Ja-doo. So Rising from the Ashes is another great resource. It's a up-to-date resource that I offer you. Paula Yu, again, great writer. I would not recommend this book if I didn't think she didn't do her due diligence there. So those are some resources that I wanted to offer to you. I can definitely send this list to President Kim or to Dr. Shim for the for your use, or for to email out to the recipients. But any questions here or any thoughts on just this really quick overview of teaching Korean immigration and history? No? Feel free to unmute yourselves as well. I welcome the questions. I'll give it one more minute. If not, we'll continue on. And we can save questions for after. All right, so we'll keep going. Oh, here's some more online and video resources as well. Sorry about that. I compiled a great list for you guys. Footsteps of Korean Americans is a history video that I won't show you because it's long. That gives you, it's about 33 minutes or so. It gives you basically this book and then some, with some interviews about Korean Americans, early immigration. Then it takes you into modern times. It takes you through everything, and it's a great little resource. Full disclosure, Dr. Chang and I produced, wrote, and distributed this. It shows on SBS and MBC, the Korean news channels from time to time. And so it's a nice little resource. It's free. It's on YouTube. If you just type up that Footsteps of Korean Americans, YOK Center, it'll come up. It's absolutely free. So please feel free to use that. And then the National Association of Korean Americans website is great. It gives you some information there. KoreanAmericanStory.org is a great oral histories website. They are constantly updating their website with new interviews of Korean Americans from every walk of life, including politicians, business folks, students, you name it. And it's wonderful to give context to the Korean American experience and how Korean Americans are experiencing this life here in the US as either immigrants or US born. The Council of Korean Americans, learning how Korean Americans shaped history, is a great website. Council of Korean Americans, of course, a newer organization formed in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years. They've been producing wonderful content and resources for educators as well. And then the Korean American Foundation in the Greater Washington area also has great resources that you can utilize. And then there's the Political Awakening of Korean American site and video. There's the link there. And the PBS News Hour also did a short on Pachappa Camp with Dr. Chang. And again, if you Google that, it will come up, but all these links are here as well. And then there are Korean American lesson plans written and provided by teachers, scholars, etc. It was available on the YLK Center website, but we updated our website, as in we completely transferred all its content to a new platform. So it's not available at the moment, but it will be hopefully by the end of summer. And those Korean American lesson plans can also be found on the California Education's website. They're there and free for you all to access as well. So lovely online and video resources for you to utilize when you're teaching Korean immigration history and Korean American experiences. Okay, so what to teach for Korean American history? I would give you these general categories. General history of Korea, it's always important to tie, right? Homeland history. What were the push and pull factors for Koreans to leave the homeland in the first place? You definitely talk about Japanese colonization, early 20th century, and why that really pushed very many Koreans to leave the homeland and seek political asylum and freedom from Japanese colonization. It's really important to teach how Korean Americans were heavily involved in the independence movement of Korea at that time, including Dosan Ahn Chang-ho and Syngman Rhee. Of course, we know Syngman Rhee's problematic, right, issues later when he becomes president and perhaps dictator, right, of South Korea later on. But it's very important to teach how Syngman Rhee was here advocating for the independence of Korea, as well as Dosan Ahn Chang-ho, who was doing the same. Culture and identity, community, this is also very important. When Koreans left Korea in the early 1900s, they did not discard their culture or their identities. In fact, they would hold Korean language classes and they would retain their Korean culture and promote it and teach their children that they are Korean because of the pride that they felt. They wanted to say and show, we are not Japanese. Just because Japan has colonized Korea does not mean that we have lost our culture and our identities. And so they would teach their Korean children, you are Korean, and they would teach them to speak the Korean language, and they would give them the culture classes and so on. So it's important to include that component in when you are teaching Korean American history as well. The independence movement, again, very important and integral to early Korean American communities. Again, the 1920 establishment of the Willows Korean Aviation School and Corps is an example of why the independence movement was so important and integral to the daily lives of Korean Americans during the early 1900s. Later, after the end of World War II and the freedom or the independence of Korea, the reunification of North and South Korea became then the focus of Korean Americans in the United States. So it changes, right? So it's important to remember that as well. Official immigration, Hawaii, January 13th, 1903, the push-pull factors, again, of why and how Koreans would come to the United States. And also one thing I didn't put in here, but I will put in here now. Oops. Let me go back. Well, never mind. I won't put it in because I can't type it in. Is to also talk about the Korean American women, the nameless, faceless Korean American women who were the backbone, right, of the Korean American communities. Pachappa Camp, for example, it is known as Koreatown, USA, the first Koreatown, USA, because Korean American women were there. They were there. They had their families. They supported their men. It wasn't just a labor camp. It was a community. And those nameless, faceless women were the backbone of that community. And I want to make sure that that is not left out either. And how might you incorporate these nameless, faceless women's stories? You might talk about how, what I just did, how they supported, right, the communities that they were part of, that they worked alongside the men. They were in the packing houses of the citrus industry in Riverside, packing all of these oranges, right? And then they were also washing clothes, working in local hotels, cleaning, cooking, raising their children, teaching the Korean language classes, going to the local churches and creating relationships. It's an important story that often is left out when we talk about not just Korean American history, but other minority histories, the women of the communities. So that's also something very important to teach as well. And of course, Pachappa Camp, something to teach as well. Here are some ideas. The Korean American involvement in the independence movement is one lesson plan that you could create. You could talk about the Korean National Association of North America, the Willows Korean Aviation School and Corps, Park Young-man, Dosan Ahn Chang-ho, Singman Ri, and you could package all of this into a lesson plan for maybe a whole week and talk about how the Korean National Association was heavily involved in why and how Korean Americans were designated not Japanese subjects during the early 1900s by William Jennings Bryan, then Secretary of State, and how this really marked Korean Americans as unique. So this allowed them to escort their immigrants from the ships, right? Because they would be seen as Koreans, not Japanese subjects, therefore not subject to certain immigration laws, right? So it's an important thing to note, and that could be a lesson plan. Talking about Willows Korean Aviation School and Course could be a whole week as well. That's a picture of the Willows Aviation pilots in 1920 to the left on my screen. And you could talk about how they were there, how they established the school with $50,000 from the Rice King. I forget his name already, I'm sorry, but from the Rice King, who became one of the first, actually the first Korean millionaire by growing and cultivating rice and selling it. And with that money, was able to help fund the Willows Korean Aviation School and Course. So it's a great lesson plan that you could create. Another lesson plan could be World War II and the story of US-born Colonel Young Ok Kim and his life here. Another one could be the life and story of Dr. Sammy Lee, the first Korean American, or actually the first Asian American to win Olympic gold for the United States in diving in the 1948 and 1952 Olympic Games. And you can also talk about the Korean War, adoptees, war brides, and the role of Korean American women and immigration. These are specific lesson plans that you could create when you are teaching Korean American immigration and history. Young-ho Kim's parents, of course, immigrated to the United States and were heavily involved in the Korean independence movement. And also, Dr. Sammy Lee enlisted in the US Army to serve during I believe, the Korean War as well. And Colonel Young-ho Kim enlisted during World War II and the Korean War as well. Highly decorated, was named one of the top generals by MSN.com. And he's often looked over in US military history, although these last few years, with Dr. Chang's efforts, he has become more well known, and Young-ho Kim's story is being told. So some lesson plans there. Some other ideas include the post-1965 Immigration Act and Korean immigration, new urban immigrants, and how the Korean American community's demographics would change drastically. As we saw in the earlier slides, we went from 300,000 something in 1980 to almost 2 million today, right? Almost 2 million today. And that number will only continue to increase. And discussing that change and how Koreans went from this very not talked about community to a very well-recognized community today is a fascinating story. So something to think about there. Korean American community characteristics are something that you could also talk about. How Korean Americans do not fit into the model minority, right? Rhetoric or mythology. Korean Americans do struggle financially, educationally, and so on. And so it's an important thing to also talk about Korean American community characteristics. Important to also talk about second and third generation Korean Americans, the shifting population from foreign-born to American-born. In the next 50 years, we will see that the Korean American population will become more, if not majority, US-born rather than foreign-born. It will be an interesting change because that generation will be participating in politics, will be participating in ways that Korean Americans perhaps weren't able to prior to 1965. Korean American community identity, anti-Asian hate, the 1970s, the 1990s, interethnic conflict, and the 1992 LA civil unrest can be something as well that is discussed. So again, those are some ideas on what to teach. And are there any questions or any thoughts yet on some of this? If not, we can keep going forward, as I know I'm probably running out of time. Am I running out of time a little bit?
You have until 9:55. Right now we're at
Perfect.
5. And
Oh,
it
perfect.
includes any Q&A time, so
Okay. Excellent. Okay, so then I'll move along then, and we'll keep going into the next topic of this discussion. So we just talked about Korean immigration, history, identity, and all these wonderful things. But one of the very big, I would say, more modern events that Korean Americans went through was the Los Angeles uprising of 1992. And what happened and how this was a watershed moment for Korean Americans. Disclosure, I myself am a child of Saigu, as KW Lee calls me oftentimes. He says, "You're a child of Saigu, Carol." Yes, I am. My parents owned a business in Compton, California, before the LA civil unrest, during the LA civil unrest, and after the LA civil unrest of 1992. Thank you, Kim Jong-rim, the Rice King. Thank you, President Kim. First Korean American millionaire. It's a wonderful story. If you do a lesson plan on anything, do a lesson plan on Kim Jong-rim. He is an amazing story. What he did and how he did it, fascinating, because he circumvented certain to lease the land that he had and become an American millionaire. It's absolutely fascinating. Okay, so going to the 1992 LA civil unrest, it is a watershed moment, a moment that Korean Americans realize we need to participate in politics. We need to do something more. Because prior to 1992, while we were in the communities, we really weren't there politically. Our political activity was small, not just marginal. It was a watershed moment. So what happened? Let's talk about that. The Korean Americans during the 1992 LA civil unrest, and remember, I'm talking about this from the Korean American perspective. I want to note that the 1992 LA civil unrest, its causes were from police brutality, from the not guilty verdicts in the case of Rodney King. We are talking about anti-Blackness, right? We are talking about police brutality and the Black American community and the ongoing issues with that, even to this day. I'm referencing 2020, George Floyd, and the ongoing issues, right? But I'm taking now the Korean American perspective of the LA civil unrest, after acknowledging again its root causes being the not guilty verdicts in the Rodney King beating case. Okay, so Korean Americans during the 1992 LA civil unrest were this small community, just very, very small and not very well recognized, except for when it came to what the media called the Black Korean conflict. And this Black Korean conflict would be promoted in the media over and over and over again, especially after Sun Ja-do shot and killed Latasha Harlins in March of 1991. And that video would be played over and over again by media, stoking interethnic conflict between Black Americans and Korean Americans. So it's a very tense situation in LA, right? It's a very tense situation. And the Black American community is looking for justice, and rightfully so, right? Rightfully so. The beating of Rodney King, he was hit over 52 times with batons, right? And they're looking for justice because of the murder of Latasha Harlins, this 15-year-old girl, right? And again, I highly recommend you read Rising from the Ashes, because author Paula Yu talks to the Harlins family, right? And really discusses all that occurred there. And then how the injustice of due sentencing would also stoke interethnic conflict, right? Because the media would again and again promote this Black Korean conflict instead of promoting peace, instead of saying, hey, there's something going on here. It was so bad that the Black Korean Alliance would be formed to try and help to assuage or alleviate tensions between the two communities. It would not help. And so when 1992, April 29th, or Sa-igu, as Korean Americans call it, would roll around, and the not guilty verdicts would be handed down in the case of Rodney King, the LA civil unrest would erupt, and it would start at the corner of Normandy and Florence in Los Angeles. And it would spread. People think that the LA civil unrest was only in Los Angeles. No, other cities throughout the nation also erupted in violence, in protest against these verdicts, right? But Los Angeles is the hot spot. It is where it would begin. And Korean Americans who had businesses in Koreatown, right, and all throughout South Central Los Angeles, or South Los Angeles, as they renamed it today, would be abandoned. Korean Americans would call 911, would ask for help, and no police would be there. Koreatown would be abandoned. And this is where you would get this image of rooftop Koreans. How many of you have heard of that term, right? Rooftop Korean. How many of you have seen that image, right? Of a Korean young man, right? With the head, yeah, right? We all have, right? And this is where it was basically taken from. Rooftop Koreans, that term was born during the 1992 LA civil unrest because Korean Americans had to defend their own businesses. No one was coming to help them. LAPD had abandoned Koreatown, would not come. My own mother, trapped at her gas station, calling 911, No one is helping her. No one is going to come and save them. Nobody, right? And so this is the Korean American story, right? They are trapped with their own businesses. They're unable to get any kind of help, nothing. And it is a terrible situation because they can't even rely on American media, right, to help them. Instead, they rely upon Radio Korea for assistance. My mom would be listening to this. Oh, okay, right. They're saying that the businesses in Koreatown, okay, this is what's happening. Oh my gosh, Ajima, Ajashi, right? They're in trouble, right? Oh no. And this is what's happening with the Korean American community. And this is a story that's never told, right? All you ever hear about 1992 LA civil unrest, it was because, right, of the Rodney King beating, the not guilty verdicts, and so on and so on. But at the same time, there is this interethnic conflict that is occurring. And Korean Americans their stores are being burnt down, being looted, being targeted. Targeted, yes. How so? Well, you had Black American, Latin American business owners putting signs in their stores saying Latin owned, Black owned, right? You name it, to try and save their businesses from looters, from rioters, right? And so Korean Americans are being targeted and no one is helping them. And it's a moment for Korean Americans when they say, we need to wake up. This is the moment that we have to start doing something. We need to have our identities. We need to get involved in politics. We need to get involved with our communities. We need to communicate. If we don't do this, we'll be abandoned again and again and again. And so it is the birth or rebirth of the Korean American identity. Some say it's the rebirth because Korean Americans were so involved with the independence movement during the early 1900s that was their identity. Some say it was the birth of the Korean American identity because it's the moment that we recognize we're not Koreans from Korea anymore. We're Korean Americans, right? That is the distinctive moment when Korean American identity is born. When we say it's not just about Korean homeland politics, it's about our politics here in the United States. It's about our communities, not just homeland. So it's a political awakening. And Korean Americans start to get involved. We raise our voices. We build coalitions. We give back to our communities. Organizations are formed, like the Council of Korean Americans, much, much later, of course. But we have basically communication. We start talking to each other. We start saying, we're here, right? See us. We're not just some marginal community. And it's an important story because it's the story of many minority communities, is it not? Without our voices being lifted, without our efforts, no one's going to care. We're only 2 million. Politicians don't care about 2 million people. They really don't. Right? They don't, especially because we're spread across so much throughout the United States. But if we make our voices heard, they will care. Because 2 million people is still a lot of people, right? It's still a lot of people to be marginalized and forgotten. When the 1992 LA civil unrest finally calms down by May 2nd and businesses reopen and life returns to normal, Korean Americans would suffer 40% of the $1 billion in damages, a disproportionate amount. Over 2,200 Korean American businesses would be destroyed or looted or damaged. That's a phenomenal figure if you really think about it, right? Considering that there were very few Korean Americans in Los Angeles, right? Yes, we had our own Koreatown, but the population is small, right? We're talking about 100,000 at that point. It is an extremely, extremely important moment for Korean Americans in history. I'm looking in the chat. Lillian says the media is at fault for sure. I remember it well. We're still feeling the effects today. Absolutely, Lillian, exactly, right? Media perpetuation of these stories truly damages our communities. I mean, now we have TikTok, right? We have our phones, right? We're scrolling all the time and all of these images, they really really tell a story that may not be true. Korean Americans and Black Americans, we do get along. We do. Is there interethnic conflict? Sure. There's always going to be interethnic conflict because we don't understand each other's cultures. But through dialogue and communication, we'll be able to trust each other. And if we trust each other, we can build something. And so Korean Americans post 1992, wake up. Now we have politicians that can and do speak up for us. Representative Marilyn Strickland, Andy Kim, Young Kim, Michelle Park Still, David Ryu, Mary Chung Hayashi, Alfred Song was our forebearer politician, right? And so on and so on. Our politicians are there now. They are speaking up for us. And it's so important to recognize this, especially when we're teaching Korean American studies or history, right? This is a very watershed moment for us. And we are definitely participating in politics, and we are definitely changing in terms of what our political leanings are. We used to be pretty Republican, right? We used to be pretty conservative, but 67% of Koreans, I believe, are registered as Democrats. 28% are as Republican. And again, that's because of the shifting, right, change in our population and the growth thereof. So it's a fascinating thing to think about as we think about Korean American political leanings and how our political awakening happened, right, with the 1992 LE civil unrest. If you want to teach Korean American history as a longer unit, you can, because it's rich in history, rich in events and stories, especially if you go to Korean American history, Korean American, I think it was KoreanAmericanHistory.org, where they tell you the stories of Korean Americans. You have so much out there in terms of resources that you can utilize to talk about why and how we're 67% Democrats today, right? How and why Korean Americans are now focused on the reunification of North and South Korea, right? And so on and so on. Topics to consider and issues to consider as well when you're teaching Korean immigration and history. Participation in politics. Anti-Asian hate is a big one, especially post-COVID, right? I mean, we're still kind of dealing with this pandemic stuff, but post-pandemic era, right? And the rise of anti-Asian hate, that's a very important one. Stereotypes and the model minority myth, the LGBTQ plus, right? K-drama, K-pop, and the Hallyu wave. These are all topics and issues that you can consider for your lesson plans as well. And Korean American visibility today, I want to end on this kind of a note, is we're more active, right? Many of you are here because you have an interest in Korean culture and history and identity. Many of us watch Korean dramas, right? Listen to K-pop. BTS is coming out of their 2-year, right, mandatory military service. So we're listening to music and all this stuff. And we're into the food, right? One way to really break ground in your classes is talk about the food. Maybe even bring some kimbap or, right, something like that to really start the interest of your students and break that bread or rice, right? And really connect with your students in this way. But we have a long way to go, right? To break these stereotypes and assumptions about our small community, right? We still have issues that we need to deal with, racism, you name it, anti-Asian hate. But we are progressing and we are making progress. That being said, I want to say the future, what is our population growth? We need to talk about mixed ethnic identities, right? Mixed race identities, right? As our population continues to grow, those are other things for the future that we definitely need to consider. Thank you very much for your time. I think we have a few minutes here for questions. I'll stop the share, but I open it up for any questions.
Thank you so much, first of all. Yes, that was a lot of great information. Anyone has questions, feel free to unmute or share in the chat. Maybe take a moment to think about a question. Oh, Carol, could you share with us the slide deck? Participants would like to access it themselves.